For those that are just coming in, we have a poll up on the screen. We're trying to encourage some audience participation as we get started. So please pull out your smartphone, scan that QR code, and tell us what you think. I'm just going to ask if everyone could start taking their seats so we can get started here in just 1 minute. We are at 3:59. We want to get started as soon as we can. And I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to answer that poll on the screen. So if you haven't had a chance to scan the QR code and put in your answer for the poll, please go ahead and do that now before I switch the screen. Okay, everyone, please take your seats. We're going to start here in about 10 seconds. Okay.
Doesn't work, but it takes a sec.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. All right.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're ready. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Global Ties Arizona's annual Chinatown Hall in partnership with Thunderbird School of Global Management. I am Kristen Allen, the president and CEO at Global Ties Arizona, and it's a pleasure to see here today so many faces to witness what is surely going to be an enlightening conversation between our panelists and hopefully with you all here in the audience today. Today, we're gathered to discuss and deepen our connection with one of the world's most dynamic and influential nations, China. As we embark on this journey of cultural exchange and mutual understanding, let's seize this opportunity to explore the challenges of the U.S. China relationship and build bridges that transcend borders. At Global Ties Arizona, we're dedicated to building strong international relationships that foster more peaceful, informed, and prosperous communities across Arizona and the world. We do this through international exchange programs and by facilitating opportunities for our community to participate in global dialogues, and we strive to create informed and engaged citizens. As a member of the World Affairs Councils of America, we have a rich tradition of hosting events such as the annual Chinatown Hall, facilitated by the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. These gatherings serve as a vital platform for community-level discussions, enabling citizens to actively participate in shaping foreign affairs agendas. We are very, very proud to partner with Thunderbird School of Global Management on this year's Chinatown Hall, and they're an amazing partner for many of the international exchange and community programs that we put on throughout the year. We're especially thankful to Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, our Director General and Dean, and Thunderbird's incredible faculty, including who we have today leading our discussion, Dr. Doug Guthrie, who's Professor and Executive Director of China Initiatives here. I'd also like to thank our event sponsors today for helping to make this event possible. Thank you to Workplace Resolutions, LLC, and the Chinese Chamber of Commerce of Arizona. We also thank the law offices of Bernard Wu for sponsoring our beverage station. Additionally, our work would not be possible without our annual partners. I've listed them here. They give us a steadfast commitment to helping Global Ties form ambassadors for the state of Arizona through international exchange and global education. We're really excited about today's event as we've modified the program this year to really allow for dynamic discussion between our panelists and the attendees. In the first hour, we're going to go ahead and show highlights of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations conversation with Deputy Secretary Dr. Kurt Campbell of the U.S. Department of State and explore audience thoughts and reactions to that conversation. And then during the second hour, we'll hear from our featured panelists who will introduce shortly, representing academia, business, and they'll be sharing their own insights working with and around the U.S.-China relationship. I also want to just make a couple housekeeping notes that statements and views expressed by our speakers are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent Global Ties Arizona's views or Thunderbird School of Global Management. We also want to share that this event is off the record to allow for free expression by our speakers, by our audience members, and if any of the news or media are present, that we express that this is an off-the-record event. Thank you very much. I would like to now turn over the microphone to Ghazal Khorshidi, Senior Director of Executive Operations and Community Outreach at Thunderbird School of Global Management.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you all for being here. I cannot even start to tell you how proud we are to host this event this year and have the honor of having all of you here. I would like to also thank Kristen for being a wonderful partner, and Global Ties and the board for being a wonderful partner. And I do believe that Kristen is one of the recent leaders who actually transformed the organization with the help of the board, and we are just so proud. I am, as a woman, is so proud of knowing you and working with you. Well, at Thunderbird, the School of Global Management, we educate, empower, and influence global leaders and managers who maximize the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. We try to move, we want our focus is advancing inclusion, sustainable prosperity, and peace worldwide. And this event and a lot of other events that we hold here is a good example of that. I would like to encourage you to actually check the North Corridor when you go up to the POP to see the origin of the school when we were still an air base, and you will see that one of the cohorts that actually were trained on Thunderbird when it was an air base was a cohort called the Flying Tigers of China. They're still recognized annually, and we still receive Consul General and the other high-level Chinese diplomats who would like to come and see actually the pictures and commemorate their training here. Thunderbird was established on the thought that borders frequented by traders won't need or seldom need soldiers, and this was the thought that the founding fathers had when they established this school here. I am so happy to see so many partners, alumni, and graduates and the students here in this crowd, and I would like to thank all of you for being here. Here at Thunderbird, we try to focus on similarities and kind of like bring cultures together, and we hope that in our endeavors, we make this world a better world for all of us. With that, I would like to also thank Dr. Guthrie for being a great representative of our school here, and the rest of the panelists who came here, and would like to actually now turn it over to Dr. Guthrie to start the panel. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. How's everybody this afternoon? Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Barry Wong. I'm chairman of the board of directors of Global Ties Arizona. As you heard from Kristen, we're honored to host this annual event in partnership this year with Thunderbird School of Global Management. Before I give you a little background about Global Ties, I would like to introduce some of our elected officials with us today from the Arizona House of Representatives is Chairman of the Commerce Committee and Vice Chairman of the International Trade Committee. Welcome, the Honorable Justin Wilmoth. Thank you. And from the State Senate, I'm not sure if he's here yet, but I'll introduce you, is from the State Senate. He's a chairman of the Education Committee and a former Secretary of State of Arizona, the Honorable Ken Bennett. If Ken's here, please stand, be recognized. But he'll be here later. Thank you. I'd like to ask the Board of Directors, members of the Board of Global Ties Arizona, if you would stand to be recognized, and the Advisory Board, because without their leadership in the governance, we would not have an effective organization. So Board of Directors of Global Ties, please stand to be recognized. Thank you. Dave, Jay, Kate, Richard, thank you, and Suzanne, thank you very much. Now, at this time, let me give you just a quick briefing about Global Ties. Our mission is to develop international relationships between Arizona and the world. In fulfilling that mission, we partner with the United States State Department in helping them fulfill their premier program called the International Visitor Leadership Program, where they, U.S. embassies around the world, nominate emerging leaders in all different fields to visit America to learn about why we are so great as a country in all different fields. So we're pleased to partner with the State Department and host them here. Another program that we have is the World Women Collective, that we work with the like-minded women of international thinking and help advance and promote women in our community. Another area is helping our high school students to learn about international affairs and civic engagement. That's called the Young Diplomats Program, and we're in our second year of the Young Diplomats this summer. So we're excited to have these programs because, as you know, because you're here, you know that we don't live in a bubble, whether it's in Arizona or America, but we have to engage around the world. And we're not going to always agree, but we need to have relationships so that if there's disagreement, we can get on the phone and work things out or have the dialogue. I also see another elected official or former elected official, the former congressman in Arizona, the Honorable Barry Goldwater, Jr. Barry, would you take a stand and say hi? Thank you. With that background and introduction, it is my pleasure now to introduce to you the person that's going to lead the program today on the China Town Hall. And we're pleased to have this new relationship with Professor and Dr. Doug Guthrie. A quick background is that Dr. Guthrie hails from the Midwest. I had asked him previously, how did you, from the Midwest, what sparked you into this international arena? It was a college roommate that was from Taiwan that challenged him to look broadly into the global sphere and more specifically into the Indo-Chinese, Southeast and South Asian and Asian region. So from there, he took it and grew his academic career, which led him to China, representing a number of premier universities in China, lived there for a dozen plus years, and his most recent post was when Tim Cook at Apple sought him out and said, I want you to lead Apple University in China to teach our executives how to do it in China. So that's where he left that last post, and we're lucky to have him here in Arizona as professor and director of the China Initiatives for Thunderbird School of Global Management. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Guthrie. Appreciate it.
Wow, what a great event and great introduction, and it's so wonderful to see you all here. And I just want to thank Barry and Kristen and Ghazal and Dean Cogram and everybody else who has made this possible for us to come together and talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart. Barry already gave you a little bit of sort of my background. If you would have asked me when I was 18 years old going to the University of Chicago if I was going to be a China scholar, I would have said no. That's not on my agenda. I'm going to go study economics, and that's it. But I had a Taiwanese roommate, and he dared me. He said, I bet you're not taking Chinese because you're afraid. And I said, no. What are you talking about? I'm taking Chinese, okay? And the next thing I knew, I fell in love with the language. And so it's been a remarkable moment and a remarkable experience. And 40-some years later, 30-some years later, I'm here. And I'm here as somebody who humbly comes in front of you as a China scholar and as somebody who loves to teach about China, but as somebody who's also so thankful to be a part of an academic institution, first and foremost Thunderbird, but second ASU, to really think deeply about the moment that we are in the world today. This is, to me, one of the most critical times that I can remember in terms of U.S. China relations. And I see some of my students in the club. Mike, I see you back there. You've heard me say this over and over again this semester. This is the moment, guys. This is the moment. It feels as tense to me in U.S. China relations as it ever has in the last 40 years that I've been studying this. But it's hopeful, because I also think Phoenix is a remarkable place to be studying these issues. One of the things that is true for my story is I grew up coming to Phoenix in the 1970s because my grandfather was a professor at ASU. And here I am back again and studying what is critical for U.S.-China relations, but also watching the transformation of this city. And so it's just a remarkable moment. And so I'm so thankful to be here with you. What we're going to do now is I want to introduce our panelists. And what we're going to be doing for our event. So, James, if we could get Diane on the screen, that would be great. Okay, there she is. Diane, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Deb. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
So I've warned our panelists, and some people here know me, I have that problem of standing behind a podium. My feet get anxious, so I'm going to walk a little bit. But we're going to basically be doing something that's a little different. And Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're trying something new. Okay, so what happens is every year for the last 18 years, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations comes out with their keynote speaker, and they do an hour-long or an hour-plus town hall. And they've developed it nicely over the years. Now with Zoom and video and everything, and they have many places, 70, I think, around the country that are watching, and they call on people, and they reach out, and it's great, right? And in the past, Global Ties Arizona would show this, and I've been a part of the panels that would talk about it. Today, we're going to make things a little more interactive. We're having our own town hall right here and now, okay? So part of the reason I'm walking, and part of the reason that you all who've had me in class know, is if you're going to sit there in silence, I may cold call you, right, Mike? And I may say, what do you think about this, right? So what we're going to do in the first half is I'm going to show you some clips. We're not going to just sit and watch the video, but we're going to watch a few clips of areas that the panelists and I have highlighted as important. And then we're going to ask you to talk, right? We're going to engage you, and I'm going to say to you, what do you think about what Kirk Campbell just said there? What do you think? How does that ring with you, okay? The panelists, I'm going to invite you guys to jump in when you want to, but we're going to leave the second hour to our experts, right? And let me introduce these experts really quickly, because I have a personal journey and a relationship with all of them. The person I met first on this panel, Diane, do you know that's you?
That's me.
Diane and I met when I was first doing my doctoral research in 1994. I lived in Shanghai, and Diane was a famous expat in Shanghai at the time. At the time, Diane, correct me if I'm wrong, there were only 700 expats living in Shanghai. The place across the river called Lujiazui was nothing except the Shanghai TV tower. So it was a new kind of economic experience. But Diane is the person who taught me how to go out and interview factory directors, which became the core of my dissertation, because Diane was the the representative in China for a little firm called Pacific Rim Resources. She also, shortly thereafter, I think Diane was the president of AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and she taught me. She taught me how to do this research. So Diane has been a long-time friend and collaborator. And it's been a wonderful journey to be here and to ask her to come check in from Shanghai. So instead of us just sitting here all in a room talking heads, let's get someone who's on the ground there, right? And so Diane and I have become very close collaborators. We've been our whole lives, but since COVID, we've become even closer. Then there's a second expert here who also has had a long-term interest in my life. I first got to know Craig when I was a graduate student, and as a graduate student, you try to show your muscles by taking people down. And there was this guy who had written this article. You remember this? He'd written this article because he happened to be in China teaching at Beijing Foreign Studies University when the Tiananmen movement broke out. And he wrote an article and eventually wrote a book. And here I am as a graduate student well, I got to tell him what he's doing wrong. And, next thing I know, this man is recruiting me to come join him at NYU. And It took us a couple of years to talk about the tensions over that, but he became a wonderful friend and mentor and has guided me throughout my career. I spent many years with him at NYU, and then when I went on to do other things, he also went on to do other things at the Social Science Research Council and at the London School of Economics, and then some other foundation work, and now is out here. And so when pandemic hit and I needed to decide where I was going to be, I was so happy to come join my friend Craig Calhoun out here. And then Tarun is part of this amazing journey that we're on here. At the Thunderbird School of Global Management, we really care deeply about global mindset and about thinking carefully about how to have a global cultural mindset. But there are some of us who really want to bring hardcore policy analysis into the mix too, right? We believe you need to actually go read the Financial Times and read U.S. News and World Report and figure out what it means that Kurt Campbell is saying what he's saying, right? And so Dominique, I'm going to embarrass you for a minute, but Dominique is a recent grad of Thunderbird, and he came to my office not too long ago and said, I really like this idea about harder edge foreign policy analysis. And we talked, right? And now there's a club that is mixing young alums and students, and it's, what is it called, Tarun? The Beijing, not the Beijing, sorry. The Thunderbird Foreign Policy Initiative. And I'm just so thrilled to be a part of it. I mean, it's just a journey. And so we thought, well, we got someone from Shanghai, and we got someone from a long-standing career, just polymath in so many different areas, and a senior person from around the world and thinking about international studies and global ties. And let's get a student, okay? And let's talk, right? And so that's the goal of what we're going to do today. So what we're going to do is we're going to show a couple of clips. And again, these guys are going to be welcome to jump in, but I'm going to mostly push you. I want to do our own town hall, and I'm going to push you to think and answer some questions. And then we're going to go turn to our panel of experts, okay? Everybody with me? Panelists, are you good? Okay. All right. So let's dive in.
Do you want to talk about this later?
Oh, yeah. You go ahead. Go. Talk about this. No, talk about it.
I don't have... Okay, well, I guess we're going to start off before we go into the videos. We had a poll at the beginning as you were entering. Some of you, I see some people are trying to hurry up and get their last response in, but we had a poll that was asking, in your view, what single term best describes China's relationship with the United States? And we had the options of competitor, frenemy, partner, and enemy. And we can't see enemy because it's all the way down and not showing on the screen, but I think that's a good sign. And it's great to see some of the responses here, and I think it will lend to the comment. Frenemy made it to first place so far. So really, I think we're bound to have some really interesting discussion.
Wonderful. Okay, so for the most part, I'm going to promise that we're not going to do long videos. This first video is a little bit longer because I think it sort of sets the tone for how we're going to have this conversation. But this one's the longest. What I want you to do is I want you to engage with what is going on in this dynamic and what Kurt Campbell is saying. Now, again, just to sort of remind people who we're talking about here, Steve Orlins is the president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. He's interviewing Dr. Kurt Campbell. Kurt Campbell is the Deputy Secretary of State, so he reports to Anthony Blinken, right? So what this guy says matters, right? He's getting it from very senior people in the administration. And again, I believe that this is such an important time for U.S.-China relations, and it's time to really kind of think deeply about what these relationships mean. So we're going to watch a little bit. I want you to take notes and be ready to discuss, and then we'll have a short, quick discussion. We'll go through about 5 or 6 of these, and then we're going to turn to our panel of experts and really kind of think more deeply as a room of how this is going to go down, okay? Is everybody ready? Okay. Now, we're going to jump in.
Tell us where we are in U.S.-China relations, where we've come from, and where we're going, and what happens assuming President Biden is reelected.
So let me, if I could, first of all, it's an honor to be with you, Steve, and I welcome everyone from many places around the United States who have an interest and are focused on where U.S. China relations are going. And I welcome you all and thanks for the opportunity. I want to say a word just quickly about Steve. If we are able to manage our way through a very challenging time, I acknowledge that and I live it. It will largely be due to key people who are passionate and committed and determined to find common ground. I know of no person who has dedicated more of their life to finding that common ground than you, Stephen. We have not always agreed, but the truth is I've learned an enormous amount from you, and I appreciate the opportunity to give and take. So look, I would say this. I think when President Biden came into power, I think there was a sense that China was testing us and was proceeding under the belief that the United States was in some sort of hurtling decline, and that they believed that they could press us in key ways, take advantage of certain opportunities in technology. And
James, a little louder, please.
What President Biden and his team has sought to do is put in place a consequential set of steps. First, beginning with investment in the key areas of national strength, which increasingly, Steve, as you know, will be in technology. Issues like semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, robotics, and recognizing that this is the high ground for national power and strategic competition. Secondly, working closely with allies and partners to build a consensus around maintaining the global operating system, which we believe has been so beneficial, particularly the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the last 60 or 70 years, I would argue that they've been the best with respect to lifting people out of poverty, huge amount of innovation. And I think the U.S. commitment to peace and stability has been a large part of that. And then I think building on those foundational pieces has been a substantial bilateral commitment to finding common ground, but also being clear-headed about engagement with China. And so what we've seen is a series of engagements, probably the most effective, as you indicate, Steve, was in San Francisco, in which the two leaders underscored that, yes, there are elements of competition in our relationship. We want to keep those elements healthy. We want to keep that competition from veering into confrontation or conflict. We believe that the way to do that is to keep lines of communication open and the ability to be able to engage when there's misunderstandings or potentials for accidents, but then at the same time find those areas where it will be essential to maintain communication and working together. I note, Steve, that you were in Beijing just the last couple of weeks with the most distinguished delegation of business and financial leaders, trying to figure out what's going on in China right now and what is the nature of our economic relationship. But
James, if we could have Diane on the screen.
Thank you. Okay, now, I know that was a lot, but I'm going to boil it down for you just to kind of give you a sense of what's key important. So here we have Steve Orlins from the National Committee on U.S. China Relations saying, what's the state of U.S. China relations? Can you summarize it for us? Right? And he goes through a couple of different things, right? He really talks clearly about the issue of economic engagement. Economic engagement is critical, and we're going to see later in the talk, and I'll reference this, but I'll give you a headliner. You know, this has been a critical year when we think about economic engagement. If you think about the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a tremendous amount of things happening for China on the global stage. We've seen first China brokering the peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Then we've seen Janet Yellen, then Anthony Blinken, then Gina Raimondo all go to China basically within 4 months. Then we see Xi Jinping get on a plane and come to San Francisco, and we saw Kirk Campbell mentioned San Francisco as kind of a key moment. That was a big deal. I don't know if people in this room got it, but the fact that Xi Jinping flew to San Francisco and came to meet Joe Biden on this territory, that was huge. That was a huge deal for people in China. And so then just kind of thinking through all of these issues and what issues lay it out. Now, I cut it off because I wanted to hear more from you than from Kirk Campbell, but he also says there are several existential issues, right? There's the fundamental issues of global trade, but there's also a fundamental issue of climate. And there's a fundamental issue of how we are going to coexist. And later in the discussion, we'll get into questions about Russia and Taiwan, which we can't ignore, right? And so what I want to do now is just take the temperature of the room. What are your views? Where do you feel we are? Like, one, you might say, I mean, we saw this nice poll that Kristen and the National Committee put up, but maybe you just think, well, frenemy, competitor, friend, enemy, I don't know. But maybe it's just not hitting you, right? Maybe it's not that big of a deal, but I want to take the temperature of this room. How do you feel? What do you think of when you think of U.S. China relations and how important of a moment that we're at right now? Okay? So I want to hear from you. And, you know, again, it's not beyond me to cold call people. So how do you feel? What are your thoughts? Yes, there he is.
I'm very optimistic. I've been working in China for 15 years now, but it's a ping pong game. For 3 or 4 years it's terrible, and then in 3 or 4 years it's better. So I remain an optimist that both countries are going to work through all of the tensions that they have.
So you remain an optimist. Both countries are going to work through all of the tensions. Are there any key areas that you're watching, Richard?
Climate.
Okay.
Trade.
Okay, very nice. Okay, somebody else had a hand up over here. Yes, please. Frank.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I've had a little experience in international relations as well. I've been in 110 countries working for the White House and the Justice Department. And I was also in Tiananmen Square just beforehand on the People-to-People conference that set up the relationship to develop business in China. At that time, they had 2 currencies and nationalized everything every 5 years. So I have a long-term perspective from that. And it's a very complicated relationship in my mind, not only from the financial perspective, business relationship, the theft of documentation, intelligence, the Belt and Road Initiative, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and the high tech, as along with oil and gas, the fuel, and I think it's all tied together in tight relationship that we don't always explore. There isn't one that doesn't relate to the other in some way, shape, or form, and we don't address those things. We take them all separately more than once, and we need to take them together. They look at a long-term initiative in decades, hundreds of years. We look at things, what's going to happen next week, and that's not going to solve it, especially when we just look at one thing.
So beautiful, and I just want to highlight one thing. So yes, very complex. We got optimism over here, we got complexity, and the complex interstitial, there's many different aspects to this, but I love the sort of pointing to the issue of, in China, people are thinking about things for the long term. They're thinking over a century out and thinking, and here we're maybe thinking a lot more short term, and maybe that's driven partly by the financialization of America and capital markets and short-term profits, but it sounds like you're a little bit concerned that we're not walking lockstep with them and thinking long term.
Correct.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much, Frank. One more. Come on. Yes.
So I worked in China for 6 years as a business professor, and I'm concerned about rumors. And I hear rumors like their economy is failing, they don't have, enough food supply, potentially their housing market's collapsing, and the other economic variables. I'm also concerned about our economy and that we're, potentially going into a recession or depression. And so for me, it's like I still have friends over there, and so I'm concerned about both countries. Not so much like the military issues, because I sort of think that, we're not going to end up in a state of war, is my optimism. So thank you for asking.
So, beautiful, and I just want to highlight a couple of things here. The rumors, yes, rumors. And by the way, these aren't just rumors. These are notions that are put out by financial leaders and financial gurus from around the world. So China surprised the world a couple of weeks ago because everybody was saying the economy is a disaster and they were going to miss their 5.3% predicted growth numbers. You know what? They hit them. And the sort of negative side of that story is, well, we know they're all just cooking the numbers. But a much more positive side of that is, yeah, and it's a differently run economy than our economy, and actually there's some really strong things going on here. So there's an interesting thing here about the dance between what's true and what's not, and what's actually happening in the economy today. And so I hope we can get back to this topic when we get to the panel of experts, because I think it's a really important topic to think about, right? Yes, okay, we got one more. Okay, I'd never want to turn away from a hand that's up. So yes, let's hear from you. Tell me your name.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Megha.
Oh, of course, right. Sorry. Yeah, I just had you in class, yes.
Yeah, I am from neither of these two countries. But as a business development student, what I see here is that this is an opportunity for both the countries to look back at the business so far and look at the opportunities that are available. Like if you look at the numbers, there has been a lot of dependency of US on China for getting the cargo manufactured and shipped from one country alone. So this is a time where the country needs to think of sustenance and also probably look at other areas or other suppliers or other sources and reduce the dependency on one supplier, more from a business strategy perspective, not from any country relations perspective.
So beautiful. Like, again, we have a couple of different perspectives on this, some more optimistic and some a little bit more frightened. But one of the things that you want to continue to think about is the interdependence, right? And how important the interdependence is. Okay, we got more hands. This is great. Let's just keep going. Please, Jose.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jose. I graduated from Thunderbird in 2009. My dad was a history professor for 40 some odd years at a local community college. And I've been watching the news since before the day that Elvis Presley died, which is kind of hard for somebody in their 50s. But I'd like to really globalize this. I can talk at the back end, and I don't have a question, I have a statement. And the statement is, when there is great power, there should be, in my opinion, great responsibility. And as we talk about these in the weeds little things about the frictions or the happiness in the U.S. China relationships, or what's it going to be, I say, I don't have a problem at all to have China rise as a global power. I mean, their whole name, Chungguo, is about them calling themselves the center. Okay, great, fine. For a millennia ago, or somewhere in the last millennia, they were, and maybe they would be once again, and right now they're the number 2 global economy. What responsibility, long term, does China want to own? And you say China, but it's really Xi Jinping or the leadership, right? Because I'm sure it's a different question if you ask the people. The people would be, let's keep this prosperity going. But in what way is the world inviting China into taking ownership of the sustenance, the maintenance, and the prosperity of the system in which they're now prospering? And if they want to argue or rival us, the United States, and I say us, the United States or anyone, for number 1 economic position, fine, great. But in what way, when you're in that leadership position or near that leadership position, do you also provide for the prosperity of others, or is it just you? And so, from the business perspective, I'd love to see the two arranged to create global business flows. That's why I asked that question, or make share that perspective.
It's a beautiful statement, Jose, and I think we got a lot of hands here, and so I'm just going to keep going while we're having an engaged dialogue. Is it Barry over here, and then I'll come back to you, okay? But yes, this is an important dialogue, and to the panel of experts, I'm going to come to you in a second before we jump in. Go ahead.
I think Americans are so naive, they're so nice, we're wonderful people, we're kind, we're generous. But if we step back from America, the Western culture, and China, it really gets down to freedom or slavery. If we would just get rid of our leaders, take Ping and Biden and take them out to the Caribbean and let Americans and Chinese get together commercially, culturally, education, there'll be peace. It's politics that ruins these relationships. But it all gets down to whether we want slavery or freedom. And I think freedom will always win out if we're strong, if we keep our strength in our country, not only militarily, but economically. We will eventually win this contest.
Okay, very provocative statement and strong, and I'm sure we'll come back to some discussion about this. Okay, just last two, go ahead, and then I'll come over to you, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I think if U.S. and China works together, good things will come out. As we can see this week, Elon Musk made special visit to China, struck some deal, then Tesla's stock went to sky, right? And if you look at this company of Tesla, the first time when Elon got into really, really big trouble, because he couldn't get cars made in the US, he went to Shanghai, and he got all of those cars made. So if we somehow can use Elon's genius for the whole country, maybe everything will work out for the benefit of both countries. I think in my sense, Elon did a much better job than Anthony Blinken, right? Yeah. And he probably met more important people as well. I don't know.
I think it's a wonderful point, and we should come back to the Tesla and Apple and business engagement piece. But before we do, Anita, over to you, and then I want to move on.
Thank you. So I graduated from a different Thunderbird over 33 years ago. And my issue is, when are we going to hold China accountable for being one of the largest polluters globally? We're not going to be able to. And as long as we naively think that Xi Jinping and the rest of the leadership in China is going to behave by Western European standards or Western American standards, we're going to get eaten. Because they're not. They simply won't. You think they're going to be a hegemony? Yes, they will. Do you think they're going to behave like a Western European hegemony? No, they won't. And that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Anita. Very, very, very welcome comment. So very quickly, before we move on to the next question, I want to just briefly call on our panel of experts. Any immediate thoughts or reactions? Tarun, let's start with you. Anything jump out at you from what you heard?
Yeah, I could only recall an interaction I had with the former Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Abbott, last month when he came to Scottsdale and ASU. And I see you smiling, Mr. Willamette. You're a big fan. But what he had to say was very interesting. He said that leadership is not the representation of people. And China is a great example of that because, I want to go back to education. In 2020, we canceled the Fulbright program to China, and we've seen a reduced amount of American students going to Chinese institutions and programs, but yet China is still the #1 percentage of international students here in the U.S. And the U.S. is the #1 destination for international studies, be it doctorate, master's, or bachelor's. And that itself is very interesting about this whole leadership and people perspective. The people are very welcoming over there, but I think there's a severe global leadership problem right now, and these two countries are the epitome of that. And I love how this crowd is so diverse, and they have their own opinions about that.
Thank you, Tarun. Diane, over to you.
Sorry, I was on mute there for a moment. Yes, I agree with Tarun. The diverse opinions that have come out of the room are amazing. And it is, as an American, having lived abroad for 40 years, it is what makes us a special group. But I can also say that in China, there's 1.4 billion people. And as much as we might want to just say the word China, like this great monolithic entity, those 1.4 billion people also have a variety of opinions on how the world should work, how their own world should work, and the impact they want to make. So many of the comments in the room, you hit right on the points that even Chinese people would be making if you flip them. And I love that about it. And the people-to-people relationships have got to continue. It's all these years, it is what has kept the relationship in balance. So that's what I'd like to say right now, Doug.
Thank you so much, Diane. And Diane, if I could, you've been engaged in the people-people relations since when did you first go to China? In Anhui province?
In 1985, I went to Anhui with an organization called Volunteers in Asia. So from the very beginning, even though in between I've had a lot of business years, I came with a people-to-people situation where I was sent to this small third-tier, it's not even a university, I would say it's a college, focused on the metallurgical industry. But those 2 years in Anhui in 1985 were the most impactful in my own personal life, but also what I learned about China from these very, very poor, my students were almost my age, were very poor. They were right off the farms and first-gen college students. And what I learned from them, it has affected how I see China for the last 38 years, because they were so open and willing to learn from everything America had to bring. They were just insatiable appetite for learning, and they continue in that way today. And I hope that we can have the same, return that U.S. students can go to China and also have an insatiable appetite for learning.
Thank you, Diane. And we're going to come back to this issue of the student exchanges because later in the discussion between Orleans and Campbell, they talk about the fact that the number of Chinese students in the United States has just fallen precipitously. And what does that mean? And so we're going to come back to this topic. I think it's a really important thing, not just because of your experience, Diane, but because I think Kristen and Barry, correct me if I'm wrong, this is what Global Ties Arizona is about, right? It's about creating these kinds of opportunities. So Craig, over to you.
Well, what I heard in the room was a very positive sentiment for partnership. Maybe some people said competitor, maybe some people said frenemy in this, but if we could be partnership, if the people could be working in partnership, we could achieve great things in China and the US. And I completely agree. I want to note one thing. That applies inside China and inside the US too. We have a certain amount of difficulty working in full partnership inside our countries, as well as we do between our countries. And our internal tensions are one of the things that creates challenges for our bilateral relationships. And so we need to strengthen that. I very much agree. Second quick point on this, though, is we talk about the people and the government, or the few individuals who dominate the government in a way that makes sense. People to people makes sense. But the people are a lot, not just of different individuals, but there are a lot of institutions. China doesn't just have 1.4 million people. It has universities, it has companies, it has municipal and regional governments. It has people in a variety of different roles, including senior people. And here too, we have the American people, but we also have CEOs, we also have governors and mayors, we also have preachers and doctors and whole organizations of doctors. So we need to think that it's not just a matter of kind of mass opinions, it's a bunch of specific kinds of relations, business to business, healthcare specialists to healthcare specialists, when we talk about building these relationships, which I think is really important. Last point I'll put on the table, maybe we'll get back to it, maybe we won't, but there's a limit to thinking bilaterally in a world which is being transformed globally. What's the Belt and Road Initiative from China? It is an initiative to build infrastructure, transportation, communications, relationships among countries, to finance that, and financial flows are part of this globalization. India is growing faster than China. There are more young people in Africa right? 50 years ago, we looked at China and said, what a young population, and they had a set of approaches to trying to deal with that with one-child families and so forth. But we now look at different parts of the world and see that young population that is the future of the world. So I think we need to be asking about U.S.-China relations in the context of relations across different regions in the world, not just bilaterally, because neither China nor the U.S. has the luxury of just dealing with the other one at a time.
Beautiful. Wow. Such great initial dialogue, and thank you all to the panel of experts who are just kind of summarizing our thoughts, but there's so much energy in this room for a variety of different viewpoints, right? I mean, it's really important because we are a democracy and we can talk about our variety of viewpoints and have an open dialogue, and it's very important to continue to have this dialogue. I want to we're going to come back to this issue, not just of multiple approaches to people exchange, but also the ways in which our two countries are seeing each other. I mean, I started out my comments saying it was a really important year and a really important moment that Xi Jinping got on a plane and came to visit Joe Biden. But to Craig's point, you know, if you talk to people in China, and Diane, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you talk to people in China about what the Belt and Road Initiative is, yeah, it's about building new markets and it's about building infrastructure and creating dependence of developing nations on China. But there are many people who will tell you it's also about a pivot away from the United States. This is Chinese people will say, this is our opportunity to not be solely dependent on our largest trading partner, but to build an entire other infrastructure over here so that when we're not invited to the table, and trust me, a lot of people in China find it offensive that they're the second largest economy in the world, the now second most populous nation in the world, the largest trading partner of the largest economy in the world, and they're not even invited to the G7. Now, some might say, well, that's because it's capitalist democracies, but we know that's not true because Russia was invited in 2008 until they were kicked out in 2014, so we know it's not about that. It's just we want to kind of keep our cards close. And so China, you can go to the kids' table. You can go to the G20. That's okay. President Biden will fly over to Bali and see you, right? But think about how that feels, right? And so, like, there is this idea, but to Craig's point, some people, even Diane and I, have written about and talked about what we call the G2, right? So maybe it's just the United States and China, but that's wrong. Like, that's not, I think, I'm sorry, Diane, if I'm calling us out. We wrote a provocative article on this, but I think that's wrong, right? It can't be that. We have to think multilaterally about all of these issues. Okay, I see a hand up, and I wanted to come to you, and then we're going to dive into another video, but I don't want to cut off good conversation because this is amazing. So, yes, Derek.
If I may comment a little bit. To really just add to your point about the G7 and China, I think you look at, it was probably a few years ago with the WTO and China's, you know, I think trade diplomacy with Lithuania. But you look at 2001 when China joined the WTO and look at how they have really leveraged that institution to really push out their own diplomatic strategies. It's a little bit scary how 2001, when China joined WTO, and you look at what it is now. You also look at other post-World War II institutions like the UN or the World Bank, etc. And you also look at how China has really integrated into those institutions. I mean, you kind of wonder, like at what point does it become a little bit catastrophic to really integrate a non-democracy into some of these institutions that are heavily fostering democracy. And then you also look at, go ahead.
I have a couple others, but thank you for that. And we'll keep on this conversation. It's an important thing to think about the role of, and you know, Professor Calhoun, I think you have written more about this than a lot of people I know, but in thinking about democratization around the world and what is the agenda, and is this just about markets, or is it about, and so I think that's what you're getting at, is what is the agenda here? And I think it's an important topic, right? But Paul, you wanted to jump in?
I think 1/4 of the time I can just bring up 3 quick points. First, TikTok.
and how the Chinese understand the national government in terms of national security prerogatives, which seems to work against the myth of the free market. Secondly, Graham Allison at Harvard University has spoken about this problem, the Demosthenes problem, which is how does a superpower deal with a rising power in terms of conflict avoidance or conflict increase. And then lastly, what was the album from Guns N' Roses? I think Democracy in China? That's a pretty hot topic, but we can speak about it, but I don't think we can talk about it in Beijing.
Okay, so beautiful, beautiful points. Tim, you want to jump right on that? Okay, Paul was not a plant for me, but I just want to say that he was I'm going to twist it into a segue for our next topic, okay? Because I think it's, one of the big elephants in the room right now is TikTok, right? What is going to happen with this particular situation, and how do we think about it, given that we may be banning TikTok from the United States, but Facebook and Twitter are already banned from China, or not even, haven't been allowed to be there at all. And so what does that mean? And there's an important point here again that comes up for Phoenix with TSMC being here and the Chips and Science Act, and Kurt Campbell talks about this. So I don't want to lose the threads of the rest of the conversation, but I would just want to use this as a moment to get Kurt Campbell's voice in here a little bit more and continue this conversation. So thank you, Paul, for the segue. That was awesome. Okay, James, if we could have the video back. Oh, look at him. He's already ahead of me, that guy.
Senior leaders as well.
You mentioned my visit a couple of weeks ago, and where we had the opportunity with some business leaders.
Yeah. James, a little louder.
One of the issues he raised, and one which I've actually raised, is kind of the over-securitization of U.S. China relations. We've seen cranes, chips, EVs, batteries fall within now a definition of national security. What's going on there, and what should we do? He's concerned that ultimately he implicitly recognized the Chinese do this too. Yeah. So can the two sides engage in a discussion of what is national security, get a definition?
Well, look, it's going to be important to have those discussions, Steve. I would simply say that the larger context here is important. Last year was an absolute banner year in trade. There's substantial investment flowing in both directions. Lots of Chinese goods come to the United States, lots of opportunities. Yes, we do hear from Chinese interlocutors occasionally about, gee, you're targeting our social media companies. I would just simply say that our social media companies are not allowed to engage in China, so there is an unequal playing field to begin with. And so, look, I think what's important on our part is to explain clearly what it means to have high walls or high fences and small yard, to make sure that only the most careful things that require scrutiny are observed with respect to potential controls or areas that we would prevent certain kinds of engagement with China. And much of those efforts tend to be in technology areas, AI chips and the like. And I think ultimately our focus in technology are in dual use capabilities that potentially could have security uses that are antithetical to our interests. And I think we've been clear about that with our Chinese interlocutors. I will also say that if you listen carefully what Secretary Yellen indicated on her recent trip, is that we're also concerned by the potential of China seeking to use their overcapacity to flood American and other global markets. And she's warned, I think appropriately, and she has worked assiduously to build stronger ties between the United States and China, but she's warned her economic and Treasury Ministry of Finance counterparts that if those steps are taken, we will not sit by idly. And what happened 10 years ago on steel with Chinese products basically squashing American competition, we won't and cannot sit by idly to let that happen.
Okay, James, can we get Diane back?
Okay, a lot there. So Paul, you weren't a plant for me, right? You really did make the segue, and we were there, right? And a couple of key things that come up. They did mention the social media issues, right? And we're at a really, really key moment here in which we got some people like the Scott Galloways of the world using sort of rational choice theory that sounds like a nuclear arms race, that if the Chinese government is trying to bring us down through TikTok, then we have to get it out of here. And, I think we can be more reasonable in these conversations, but it is true that our social media companies aren't allowed in China. And so what does that mean? And how do we think about these kinds of discussions? And so we got that part of the technology, but then what Kurt Campbell's also talking about has direct relevance for Phoenix because TSMC is here. Right? There is going to be a fab that's built in the desert that is really about the ways in which companies like TSMC are working directly with the United States, and Chinese companies are prohibited from working with the United States because of the CHIPS Act. And so this is a very interesting moment in terms of thinking about this. Now, Campbell would argue, I think, that there's what he calls an over-securitization of this trade conversation. So we need to have a few things over here. I got you. We need to have a few things over here, and then the rest of the conversation over here, and is there an over-securitization? But that's the kind of key point that he's raising there. And then the final key point, I think, is mentioning Yellen, right? And talking about Yellen, I think, was a very interesting trip because she went there, and it's good to have Secretary of Treasury showing up and visiting Xi Jinping. But it's also, I think, a little bit strange optics to have her waving her finger and saying, like, enough with the overcapacity. You're making us lose in solar panels in global markets. Well, you guys argued for deregulated markets, and now we're beating you, right? And so then Secretary of Treasury comes over and shakes her finger about it. So I think it's an interesting dynamic to think about. He's raised them all here. Okay, so Paul, you wanted to jump in, but I want to hear from others from the audience.
Super quick, just PRC considers Taiwan Chinese also. So one way you can look at it in the long-term picture is that TSMC is their fellow brethren doing well, but not necessarily China as opposed to Taiwan from the Chinese global long-term perspective.
Wonderful point. Thank you for raising that, Paul. That's great. Yes. Tim, you had your hand up before, so we're getting to you now.
I think we ignore at our peril an opposing viewpoint about diplomatic reaches to the Chinese government. And it appears to me to be growing. And it's based on observation of past behavior of Xi Jinping. Every time we throw him a crumb or a loaf, he gladly accepts them. And what has the reciprocity been? Has he ever done so much as thrown us a crumb or a loaf? Not on your life. Some of the people who hold this view say he's laughing at us behind our back. Let's take a look at some of the issues and see how he's bent or not. How about intellectual property? You would think if he wanted to make nice, he'd say, well, that's an easy one. We can fix that. Nothing. They're still stealing our intellectual property. How about his headlong attempt to grab any of our technology, anything that he can get? Or does it appear that he is going to moderate his approach to our current elections? Not according to all the intelligence that we get. They say he's building up more than he ever has before. So I think that the idea of China is really the idea of Xi Jinping, and he has said unequivocally, despite all our outreach, 2027, we're going to invade.
I want to come over to Vivian. You had your hand up a little bit ago, so were you? But let me just mention one thing, and then I got somebody in the back here. Very provocative stuff, Tim, and I think it's important to have all of these issues on the table. The one thing I'll just say personally from my own experience, when we talk about China stealing technology, I was a part of a company that gave a tremendous amount of technology because it made them the most profitable company in the world to be able to operate in China's manufacturing supply chain. So there is a notion of stealing it, but there also is a notion of Apple holding out its hand and giving it and walking away to the bank. And so I think it's a complicated story and a complicated dynamic, but I think that this is a big conversation. So let's come back to it, and I would love to talk to you more about it. Vivian.
I just wanted to comment on the gentleman saying that China sees Taiwan as a renegade province. As a child of immigrants from Taiwan who actually, my parents escaped China and went with the KMT to Taiwan. And then my family came to the U.S. and I was born and raised in the U.S., so I consider myself Taiwanese American. I think if you talk to certain people in Taiwan, they believe that they are a democracy of 24 million people. They do not see themselves as China, as perhaps China may try to weld that kind of perspective. So I think just to throw that in there is that Taiwan, and certainly when Hong Kong was also did not go back to China. Now it's considered a special administrative region, and certainly Macau. So these are the three provinces that China sees as renegade, but Taiwan does not, I do not believe that China sees themselves as part of, Taiwan does not see themselves as part of China. So just, I think to be mindful of that, there are people in the room who are byproducts of a lot of the conflict that has happened from China and Taiwan, and they sit here before you today as witness of that. So I just want to throw that into the mix. It complicates things quite a bit. So I think this whole discussion is kind of complicated, but just wanted to kind of say that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, very complicated, and thank you. I want to hear from you guys, but we want to make a quick move. I'm going to call on Lisa, and then I'm going to ask our panel to come sit up here, and we're going to continue this conversation. I have to tell you, we're not getting through as much video as I wanted, but I love you guys for that, because that means we're having a really interesting and exciting and important conversation, and that's what we wanted to do, right, Kristen, Barry? That's what we're trying to do here, okay? So video schmidio, I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is hearing from you guys and hearing from our panel of experts. Lisa, over to you. We'll come back to you guys, I promise, okay? Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I grew up in China. I came to the U.S. over 30 years ago. I just want to mention two things. One is related to Taiwan. The lady in the front mentioned, she's kind of consider herself Taiwanese. I think even in Taiwan, a lot of people think Taiwan's still part of the China. Apparently, there's some people think Taiwan can be independent, right? That's a huge risk. I'm an investor of TSMC. As we know, TSMC is expanding here. But you look at the TSMC's PE ratio compared to NVIDIA, it's much cheaper. When I talk to the investment community, people always consider the political risk, right? NVIDIA doesn't have the political risk. Taiwan has. What if China, invade Taiwan? What's going to happen to TSMC? How is that going to affect Taiwan TSMC stock, right? That's a huge risk. I'd like to hear, from the expert. Right?
Thank you for that question, and we will hear from the experts. And by the way, on the video, which again, we're cutting short some of the video because I just want to continue this dialogue, but this topic comes up. If you've watched it, one of the people in the town halls asks Kirk Campbell directly, is there going to be a war over Taiwan, right? And so I'm not going to let this panel off the hook without us having a little bit of conversation about that, but we'll get to it, okay? I promise. Okay. Craig, Tarun, let me have you guys sit down, and then I want to call on our panel of experts to sort of jump in with what you've heard so far. Diane, if I could put you on the spot to go first, just continue your your musing on what you're hearing, but also specific to the issues of things like business environment and social media and the over-securitization of the economy, of the business discussion. What did you hear and what are you thinking about? Let's hold off on the Taiwan discussion for a minute because we are going to come back to that topic, okay? Diane, over to you.
Thank you, Doug. Again, I think I'm really happy to hear that people have been in the U.S. for 30 years, and because it mirrors the 40 years. So over time, one has a perspective based on experience. If someone says to me, this moment between U.S. and China is the most difficult, most fractious moment ever, then I know they've only been in China 20 years. Because China from 2000 until, say, the COVID was a different animal than the previous 20 years. And in that previous 20 years, the US and China did, in fact, have some pretty intricate and dangerous interactions that if they were to happen today, with China, of course, being a much stronger military and global leader, would be dangerous. So the US bombing the Chinese embassy in Sarajevo or Yugoslavia at the time, the downing of a military aircraft in Hainan, where the pilot actually died. The Chinese pilot died. And I have an experience with that where I was driving a few days after that situation, which you read in the paper, but you don't take it personally. It's like, okay, that is above my pay grade. But I was driving to a new factory in Zhejiang province in Shaoxing, and just myself and the driver, and I got out of the car, and as I stood up, right in front of me was a bulletin board. All factories have these bulletin boards. They have announcements on them. But right there in front of my face was a picture of this pilot, Wang Wei, who had been killed, and his wife and son. And my driver had gotten out of the car, and I looked over at him and I said, "Why is this picture here?" And he said, "Oh, this is his hometown." And I was taken. I said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I would have delayed this trip. I would have not come now." But I was there, and the leaders of the factory were coming out the front door, so I put on a friendly face and I walked in. And the group and we had these great discussions. I went around the factory, commented. The political situation was never proposed, was raised. I didn't say anything, they didn't say anything. So we talk about there being a good relationships between people, and it's these moments I want to stress that can overcome a lot. And so eventually, years later, we did have a relationship with that factory, not immediately, because there's a lot of things to be changed. But by being in China and interacting with people, we do, in fact, bring our values to the table. And I know there's been some voices here, especially the freedom and slavery comment. Sometimes we're too binary in our discussions about China and probably with many other countries. So in looking at where we are today and our challenges, yes, there's another word that the Chinese like to use. It's called contradiction, 矛盾. It was probably one of the first words I learned outside the textbook. And it is how the Chinese people see all situations. And we're using the word complexity today. They would use the word contradiction. And to the ability, say, in quantum physics, the whole concept of quantum physics is two particles could be black or white, right together. It's the same thing as to hold two opposing ideas in our head. So I love these comments. It's really eye-opening to me to hear them and the variety. I hope we can continue that, Doug.
So thank you, Diane. And I want to come over to Craig next and then Tarun. But let me just jump in on one thing Diane said, because I just want to emphasize it and echo it. So Diane, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but one of the things I've heard is one of the things that I learned from you from the earliest on. Again, when I met Diane, there was 700 expats living in Shanghai. And we all believed that continuing to fight for people-to-people exchanges through business relations, right, Diane, was the way in which China was going to gradually change. I mean, that's what back then when I was doing my dissertation research, that's what we were writing about. Like, what does the joint venture mean? And how are we actually thinking about these kinds of, and that brought China into the WTO. And there was an acceleration of that line of thinking. And I think, you know, we're 25, 24 years past that now, and it's just, we're still dealing with the complexity of the dynamic. But, you know, thinking about people-to-people exchanges, thinking about business relations, thinking about the complexities of these things, I just think is so important for thinking about these engagements. So, Dr. Calhoun, over to you.
Okay, let me just jump on the bandwagon of, yes, people-to-people exchanges, which means a lot of different institution, different specific kinds of people connecting with different sorts of expertise. So this is absolutely crucial. It also means people who are younger than I am rather than our national leaders of either party or Xi Jinping who are older, right? And so one of the real questions is what kind of relationships among 40-year-olds are being built here? What kind of future attitudes with 20-year-olds? And that's not going to happen bilaterally between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden or Donald Trump, either one, right? So there's another question about the way we relate. Secondly, we are rightly worried about war, partly because there are wars in the world. And they aren't wars with China. This is not the war of an invasion of Taiwan. But there are wars in which both China and the U.S. are connected. So the Russia-Ukraine war has intensified Russia's links to China, including around oil and energy exports. The Middle East conflict with Israel and Gaza has opened up a new fault line. And let me just say that runs all the way up to the northwest boundaries of China, because the Middle East has a sort of north-south axis from the Gulf and Saudi Arabia and all this, all the way up to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, right? Xinjiang, right? So that the world is drawing China and the U.S. in, right? Both countries right now have extremely resilient economies historically that are hitting rocky places. The U.S. in many ways more, but we should see both of these as resilient economies that can potentially work through this situation. But it's going to be a somewhat different one from any past that you might imagine going back to in this. So a perspective I have on this, so I happen to have had connections to diplomats in China. So just a small narrative, not as deep a personal story as Diane or Doug. But so I was the president of the London School of Economics for a number of years, which is the institution to which China first sent employees of the foreign ministry to be trained in a project, a 50-year project that started in the middle of the 1970s to train enough diplomats, all right? What does that mean, train enough diplomats? Well, they had ambassadors and things. It means if you're going to be in the WTO, if you're going to be in all of the different kinds of treaty relationships around the world, the international standards institutes that determines, you know, a variety of kind of industrial standards, you have to have a lot of diplomats. And so China set out on a national project to become competent, to have the educated population to be able to be effective in global relations, in business, in security, at the same time. And this initially was a project of just being included. It became a project of being a leader in Asia. And it has become a project of being a global leader. But you can't understand that as just a change in Chinese attitudes. You have to understand it as China's perception of faltering leadership from the U.S. In China, right, the U.S. looks like it's lost some of its grip, that the reason security concerns are such a big issue, whether you see that as an opportunity or a threat, is because the U.S. doesn't have the kind of strong hegemony that it's had in different forms since the end of World War II. Right? Now, that hasn't been perfect. We had the Vietnam War, we had the Cold War, we've had other things. It's not that we just dominated, but we were able to be a preeminent security player. As the immediate past head of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, oddly my classmate, Richard Haas put it, right, we played the role of a reluctant sheriff, right? We did a lot of sheriff work around the world. And we began to think that was too expensive, that we didn't want to do as much of that work. So security and economic prosperity are not separable. Sometimes we look at these issues and they look mainly like economic opportunity issues. Sometimes the same sort of growing international linkages look mainly like security issues to us. And we need to think about this. We have agency. We have some capacity to determine how we're going to see these. They're not just objectively either security or economy. These are different handles by which we can take hold of how we're going to build relations with each other.
Thank you, Craig. I mean, again, a lot of important issues on the table here, and I want to continue to come back to a lot of them. But one of the things that just jumps out at me that you were talking about, and I think it's an important point to emphasize, yes, it is true, for the last decade, we've been thinking about Xi Jinping. And often we talk about, somebody said it, China is Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping is China right now. And that's how we think about things. And yes, Xi Jinping has been, was a surprise to all of us in the China field. I mean, we knew somebody stronger was going to come in. We thought it was going to be Bo Xilai. We didn't realize what was coming. That being said, to Craig's point, the project of sort of internationalization, diplomatization, this has been like a 50-year project. I love this story about the London School of Economics. I didn't know that, but...
And I'll add, it's Yang Jieqi.
Yeah.
Jieqi was the first of in the first batch of those students, who goes on to be foreign minister, architect of a lot of the foreign policy of China, that comes out of this very project.
And just to be, one of the things that I think is really important here, and I don't mean to name drop, but I'm going to name drop for a minute. But, you know, like, when we were having some problems, and I was advising the leaders of Apple in China, and you know, I was fascinated by the fact that Justin Lin, who we all thought was going to be the first Chinese president of the World Bank, he left his job. Why? He went back to China because he wanted to be a part of what was going on in China. And Justin and I were friends because we were in Washington at the same time. And so I called him up, and I was like, you know, he was at Beijing University and building a new center, and I was talking to him about what we were struggling with at Apple, and Justin was, and I respect Justin as an economist. I think he's a smart guy, and I think he's not an ideologue, and I think there's a reason why he was headed for being chief economist of the World Bank. And he wasn't name dropping, but he was like, well, Doug, just let me, in my weekly with Xi, I'll just figure out what to do about this. And I was like, wait, what? And he was like, well, I have weekly meetings with Xi Jinping. I mean, a lot of us economists do because, you know, like we're trying to figure, and I was like, felt lightened a little bit. I was like, Xi Jinping's talking to Justin? Okay, all right, okay. But again, like we think about these things in sort of the thumbnail sketches, whether it's us making thumbnail sketches of Xi Jinping or them making thumbnail sketches of our presidents. But I think that there's a complicated history here. And so, yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Tarun, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with you know, both my colleagues right here. And going to the point about, you know, security and economics playing together, you know, I want to go to a point. Let's go back to when I was born, or most of the points that you've spoken here, I wasn't even born. But just putting that out there. But yeah,
why we need the younger generation here.
Yeah, you know, if we look at national security or global security, as a matter of fact, one thing that's really changed over the past few years is that technology has become a big part of it. You know, it's not only technology in obtaining satellite images for, you know, strategic positioning of your military or, you know, where you want to keep your troops or if you want to extract your troops from a place, but it's also about everyday technology that I use in class, that professor uses to teach us, and, you know, for all of us to talk with our family across the world. And, you know, the very interesting part over here is that we only see two players in this. You know, if you look at the technology market, you know, with Meta and ByteDance owning everything about that, there really is, it's really up in the air. You know, especially, you know, speaking as a point of a student, the one problem that we face is misinformation. And that goes back again to national security, and that goes back again to bipartisan solutions or multilateral trade, security, economics, and all that. So I think right now with TSMC coming right here, with Phoenix, Arizona being the global hub of that, and with Congress working on TikTok and Meta being shut out of China for a long time, that really opens the door for new opportunity. And it really is a matter of time until we get a new platform which is global, and it doesn't have to be Harvard, or it doesn't have to be Peking University, or I'm just naming names here, but it could be coming out from a random place, and probably that's going to be the next big global security threat. But I think technology is the big factor over here that's causing all these problems.
Beautiful. Okay, so great to hear from all of you, and again, great to hear from all of you. What I want to do is I want to dive into a couple of more videos. We're going to go quickly through them because I really want the conversation to be really what's driving our interaction together. We still have about another half an hour, and then we're going to go up to the pub and continue the conversation. But it's very important to keep the voices out, but I think we also need to just kind of continue to hear what leaders like Deputy Secretary Campbell are saying. And so this next clip, and I'll be quick with it, but this next clip is really about, and I think you brought up the issues of that we hear rumors, but there are a lot of questions about what China's struggling with right now, right? And it's not just, are they going to make their 5.3 projected growth rate for Q1 of 2024? There's a lot of issues. There's the property issues. There's the what they call the lying down youth population. And so there's a number of things to think about. And so I just want to hear a little bit about that and kind of raise that question.
Issues with President Xi, the concern about the Chinese economy, concern about the investment environment, and he responded, that reform and opening has been the foundation for China's success, and will go in that direction. We'll continue to go in that direction. Of course, the business community says, well, the proof is going to be in the pudding. Yeah. We got it exactly what you're saying. We have to see how things are.
Just on that, Steve, I will say this. Look, I don't envy the current generation of financial diplomats in China. The challenges are enormous, but they're also following in the wake of literally the most effective global diplomats, financial engineers of modern times. Wang Qishan, Liu He, these people were incredibly effective at managing the opening to the West and trying to preserve certain advantages. I think some of the current team have a lot to prove, and I think there's pressure on them to try to be able to take the necessary steps to deal with youth unemployment, property challenges, issues about domestic demand, global confidence generally among Chinese firms. These are all things that, frankly, are unrelated to the United States that China will have to deal with.
I want to go to our...
Okay, can we get Diane back? All right, I love, we're all guilty of name dropping, I guess, but like for me, the fact that, Deputy Secretary Campbell was talking about Liu He and Wang Qishan, and really recognizing just what the challenge has been, right? So if you think about this period, there was a period under Deng Xiaoping of just opening to the West, and then there was the period under the next generation in the 90s of attracting foreign capital and joint ventures. And then there was the entry into the WTO, and there was no longer allowed to have a quid pro quo for market access, right? And that's the era that they're talking about now. And then we saw the entry of Xi Jinping. And so, Diane, I want to come over to you because I love that Kurt Campbell is sort of sounding empathetic in saying, the challenges have been really great over the last decade for these leaders, and, walking in their shoes must be hard. What do you see from in China, Diane, in terms of thinking about the headwinds that are being experienced right now?
Yes, I was taken by his appreciation for the technical capabilities of the leaders. Actually, the Chinese people also are watching their government, and they're watching the decisions that are being made. And they see that this is a new set of leaders that have not had that responsibility before, and the whole global situation is changing. And China's not where it was even 10 years ago, right? So there's an appreciation, and I would also say concern, just the way we would be in the U.S. concerned about our leaders. There is an expressed concern about what the decision-making process is and where they're headed as a country. Craig mentioned the word agency. It may come as a surprise to people, but the Chinese people have agency as well. And they have their own style of agency, meaning that they are able to put their opinions forward through the channels that are available to them. And no, they don't have, the voting, the democracy that we are familiar with, but they put their opinions forward in a different way. And these concerns that are out there do in fact is causing capital flight at this moment. There's a lot of middle-aged, especially those who've been in the investor industry. I think we do need to separate when we talk about business. I would ask everyone to be very careful. We're not talking about all business when something happens. There's two kinds. There's the investor community, the BlackRocks, the Carlyles, the family investment companies, and then you have the companies that make things, the corporations that are actually buying, selling, and manufacturing. It's really in the financial area that the companies and the investors are struggling and not investing in China right now because they're not getting the returns. So the returns are now in the U.S. In fact, a lot of companies, young investors want to come to the U.S. where they think they can make more money. Because that's where the U.S. government is spending right now in the infrastructure, in the defense industries. These are places to invest. So in China on the ground, we are seeing it from the local point of view, where are we headed, where's business headed, where the government headed, and then globally. I think the global perspective is quite important to the Chinese, not only the government, but the people themselves.
So before we come to our other two experts here, I want to come back to the audience because I wanted to go to Diane directly because she's sitting on the ground and we're talking about on-the-ground issues. But I just want to kind of push on this issue and see what you guys think. I think it was a striking moment that Kurt Campbell, who's, he reports to Anthony Blinken. And, they've been pretty tough on, particularly with this last trip. I mean, we're watching right now what Blinken has to say to Xi Jinping and to the other leaders of China. But here we see this moment where Kurt Campbell says, the people who are the architects of this right now, they deserve our empathy. This is hard, right? Do they? What do you think? Like, as we sort of analyze these questions, it's hard, but do they deserve our care and empathy? Should we worry about it? Now, I know that some people were talking about the climate, and that's one question, but there is just a larger question about continuing to lift people out of poverty, continuing to develop. Yes, please. And your name is? Dwight.
I'm also a Thunderbird graduate, and I just would like to mention in that their way of thinking in China from a corporate perspective is far different than what we have here in the West. In that, I grew up in the cellular infrastructure business, in that under the auspices of Motorola. Motorola is no longer in the cellular infrastructure business because they basically, apart from some poor management decisions, been driven out of it. Why? Because when they first started out in China, and I was very much part of that, and that took me to China innumerable times, was shipping equipment out of Illinois and other places here in the States to China, CKD, so it could be rebuilt in China at provincial factories, government-owned factories, and eventually that migrated from CKD completely knocked down to they're going to build their own. And the same thing happened with the mobile phone part of it. I mean, Motorola, I was with them almost 15 years, went huge into China. And they're no longer in existence with that piece of the business. And when you think of it, it's a shame because Motorola is the inventor of the cellular phone, the cellular industry. in that. They're no longer there. And other companies are bit players because of corporates, for example, Huawei. I was a contract manager in Kuwait for nearly 13 years, and that network was built on Huawei technology. And I can tell you that a lot of that was subsidized funding, and that many orders were given away basically free to go to work to the Kuwait Telecom, to go to work and build out that network. I can tell you, I issued many zero-value purchase orders in that were in the millions and millions. And that, so this is, they think about their whole corporate approach differently than Western corporates who would get away with that or live with very long. And I guess the last really brief point in that, because I spent a fair amount of time in the world of cross-border trade financing, and I have on a monthly basis a lot of contact with parties in Africa, which is a big growing market. And one of the concerns that they have and that they're seeing in some of their countries is what I would call predatory financing, where the Chinese are coming in and financing projects in that, but they're writing the financing terms and conditions in such a way that there's no way that the borrower, in this case government or private entity, can actually abide by those in the long run. And so then you end up in default, and then they take over. And so there are real world examples there. So again, they follow by a different set of marching orders and corporate guidelines than we do here in the West.
Thank you, Dwight. This is so insightful, and many of us remember those days of Motorola in China. Diane, I know you do, and I remember those were some of the early case studies that I remember. I want to just put this provocative statement out there, and I want to maybe come back to you in a little bit, Craig, to ask you to talk. Oh, Diane has something to say too, but we got another hand over here first. But the thing I want to highlight here is nobody's forcing these corporations to be in China. And so, I wasn't deeply into the Motorola conversations, but I was deeply in with another company, and we could have left. But we were making too much money by utilizing the supply chain. So, it's interesting when we talk about stealing intellectual property, but there's a lot of companies that are willing to give intellectual property so that they can have access to this very efficient manufacturing supply chain. And so there's an interesting dance there. But I want to come back to these, and Diane, I saw you have your hand up, and Craig, I want to hear what you have to say about this. But before that, Representative Justin Wilmoth.
Wilmoth, yes. I'm probably the least qualified person to have a microphone tonight, and I know that because I'm one of 3 people that ran for elected office. Mr. Wong and Mr. Goldwater were all idiots for doing this to ourselves. I'm a student of history of the Cold War, and I do believe we are in a second Cold War. The fact is, and it has not been mentioned tonight yet, that we are dealing with a tyrannical communist government in China. The Chinese people, I'm sure, are great. There's a lot of trade. There's a lot of opportunities in China. I'm largely a fan of that. But it cannot go without saying that we are dealing with a government entity that over the course of 80 years of the 20th century killed over 100 million people. I ran a bill a couple of years ago to protect Uyghurs from being utilized for slave labor in state contracts. These are real issues that we're dealing with in this country and in these states. And I really felt like that was worth mentioning because we're dealing with the Thucydides trap of the rising power challenging the great power. And they're a patient people, and we're not. We're a microwave culture, and we want all this stuff figured out before the next election. I can say that because that's how I live my life right now, 2 years at a time. And so right now our society is dealing with 2-year cycles on how to deal with all these issues. And they've got one leader, one government, no challenging, decades and decades of continuing the same push on what they want, and that is global primacy. If you've checked lately that they think that their territorial boundaries go to the Philippines now in the South China Sea. That violates so many international treaty laws, it's not even funny. This is what we're dealing with here, and I wanted to mention that because ultimately, while we're trying to do business with them privately, we do have an issue with them on the geopolitical front moving forward into the 21st century.
Thank you, Representative Wilmoth. Okay. Strong statement, and it's, this is part of the spectrum of things that we want to talk about here, and I want to come back. So, okay, goodness, got a couple of other things. Before I come over to you all, Diane, did you want to jump in really quickly? You had your hand up.
But I think you sort of touched on it, Doug. I wanted to get back to the African. Let me step back a level to misinformation and media headline clickbait. So the idea that other people don't have a brain or a choice is really insulting. I'll be very strong on this. There's a lot of strong voices there. We think we Americans are the only people that see what's going on You know, most of the African countries and us, the leaders were trained at the London School of Economics or at Harvard or at Stanford at these very elite institutions, and they go back and they're running their countries. They can't read contracts? So I think there's an exaggeration being made about the debt trap. This is that debt trap conversation, and it's already been debunked, and it's been debunked where the U.S. government doesn't bring it up. So once something has been debunked, you don't hear about it anymore, except as a rolling rumor. So I think we should be careful on those things because we tend to insult others when we think we're the only people that see it. So I just wanted to touch on that particular topic because it just keeps coming up, but it's already been solved.
Well, thank you, Diane. And we will continue to keep back and forth on a couple of things. So I got Jenny, then Charles, and then Mark.
First of all, I would
Okay.
like to say that every country, every family, there is a culture behind that. In the West, where the culture come from is from Greece. What is Greece culture is? There is fundamental sin. Nobody is perfect, right? Now, in the China, everybody is searching for perfection. Your sin is not forgiven. Your sin is not allowed. Therefore, you have to perfect yourself. And that's exactly what Diane was saying. That's why Chinese are always searching for how to improve themselves. And then I'm so impressed with Anita. She pointed out, when you deal with China, don't expect them to have the same rule as when you deal with Germany. Why? Germany is the same with Greek philosophy, Greek culture. There's a recognition of the sin. There's a recognition of forgiveness. But that's not the case in China. Okay, and then exactly what we're talking about, that Elon Musk will go to China to ask for the production, and look at what happened. They copied the EU. That's why they're going to dominate the EU EV in the world as well. And then, by the way, there is a law, because in the West, you have a law, because there's a right, there's a wrong. In China, there's no law. They have a law, but they do say that. Even their professors say the purpose of the Chinese law is to protect the government's interests. And who is the government? It's done by a human. What does that mean? There is a flaw. Whatever they feel like, every Chinese is always searching to become the next emperor. That's exactly what Xi Jinping is doing right now. And you can see that Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, and then this is going around and around and around. Ever since the beginning of Chinese history till now. And then you talk about the Chinese, whether the China is going to attack Taiwan or not. The answer is, I don't think so. You know why? Chinese does not want to die. The Chinese does not want to have a conflict. Even in the Xiaosangzhou, around that time, there were two countries competing, one to attack the other. The diplomat come to the other nation, will take out the belt and explain to them, this is our boundary, this is how we're going to attack. The other country will say, this is how we're going to defend. After they talk about that, they say, well, okay, this is going to withdraw. There's no war. And that's exactly going to happen with China and Taiwan right now.
Okay. And we are going to get to the Taiwan question, so Jenny sort of set us on, but I want to hear from Charles and then Mac, and then we'll move on.
Hi, I'm very interested in the Motorola story that gentleman brought out earlier. There are two things here. One is the cooperation with China. Is that what brought Motorola down? Or it's simply technology? We have Apple now. A lot of Apple phones are made in China. So we have like 3 or 4 different dimensions all mixed together. And I think America is great. It created Apple, it created Motorola, and a lot of companies phase away in time. But whether to work with China or not is a very big issue here. And the real question is, working with China, will that benefit the US or will that hurt US, right? That's the real question. But if you just hold your iPhone, everyone has iPhone. Most of those iPhones were made in China as we speak, right? People don't want to buy the one that is made in India yet.
Thank you, Charles. And this is an important topic and lots of thoughts on it, but we're going to go to Mac.
All right. I have more of a question for the panelists and anyone who's spent a significant amount of time doing business in China than a comment. But as someone who's just getting started with my career, what advice would you give young Americans who have sort of a shared set of democratic values like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association? What advice would you give to young Americans who might do business in China on staying true to those values while operating in a business environment like Hong Kong, for example, since 2019, where those types of values aren't as valued as much, where it's more difficult to kind of stay true to those values and where it's a challenge? So that's my question.
So I love this question, and Mac, I hope you'll forgive me for this, but I would like to defer your question a little bit. We have about 15 more minutes, and I mean this in the best way. I want to end on your question, okay? So because I feel like that's a good place for a Thunderbird audience to be ending on, and we're going to hear from the panelists on that. So I'm not avoiding your question. I'm just saving it for best for last, okay? Because I want to talk about two other important issues. But thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question, and it's a great question for an academic institution to be thinking about, okay? So we're coming to you. But in our short amount of time left, and Craig, I do want to put you on the spot about this sort of financialization and like corporate interest, but I'm going to rely on your brilliance to squeeze that into whatever other questions we have. But we do need to talk about two key issues. Two of them have come up. One comes up in the discussion between Orleans and Campbell, and the question is, and we're going to just go internationalization for a minute, right? The question is, how damaging is China's relationship with Russia? What does that mean for the United States and for how we're thinking about it? And so it's in the video, and we won't play it now because I just think we're tight on time. But it's a very interesting question, right? And this question segues in to the question about the situation with Taiwan. And so there is, if you go and watch the video, I won't play it again because it's a long interlude, but there's a very, very clear and clearly defined and clearly asked question from the audience of somebody in Middle America who is called upon, and she says the question, is there going to be a war over Taiwan, right? And we all have our theories on what's actually going to happen. I have my own. I'm sure the panelists have their own. But the real interesting question is not just, is there going to be a war, but how do we actually think about continuing not just people-to-people exchange, but idea exchanges such that there's engagement around these questions so that we don't end up in a new Cold War and the brinksmanship of a real war. And so I want to call on the panelists to kind of jump in on this, and then we're going to come back to Mac's question, which I think is a really important one. So Dr. Calhoun, can I put you on the spot? Let's talk about internationalization. Let's talk about militarization. Let's talk about anything you want, but just these two very tough topics, Russia and Taiwan.
Yeah, as long as I answer the question whether there's going to be a war. Turn that around. What would it take to not have a war might be a better way to approach this than just a sort of up or down, will there be one or not, right? And what are the factors that push towards war, that pull back? First, war, between China and the U.S. is almost unthinkably dangerous. Chinese leaders say that, U.S. leaders say that, they know it, right? So they aren't saying, oh, great, let's have a war, right? There's what sort of actions short of a superpower war between China and the United States can take place? Can China have confidence that if it seizes Taiwan by force, it will not get into war by the U.S., with the U.S.? And it's an open question, and that's where some of the connection to Russia comes. So you look, well, Russia invades Ukraine. There is an expectation that the West is going to be more passive in the face of that than it is. So Russia is surprised by the extent of global response, but we also aren't sure how long that global response is going to last, because one of the themes running through here, and it goes to the Motorola question, and you've brought it up, and others, is Western culture, whatever else it is historically, is not really good at taking the long-term view, and current American culture, as an example of Western culture, is not. So one of the issues corporately with business is, do you have to have profit for the next statement, the next call with investment analysts and so forth? How much can you say we're taking a 10-year view to change the market? We're taking a 20-year view. Well, this goes to the relations with Russia. Let me just back up on that. This didn't just start with the Ukraine war. This starts a long time ago. China and Russia have various common experiences. Yes, there's communism. Yes, there's all this. Let me point to one that isn't as obvious. China and Russia each tried to embrace the West and felt the West did not embrace back. Right? Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, invested very heavily in a Western-style economic model. It was very financialized, not just it was Western, but a lot of money comes in, a lot of security exchanges, a big bang approach. It tries to join the big global groups, tries to partner with Europe, and part of the backstory to what happens in Russia is feeling they never were going to let us be taken seriously as a country. We're huge, they're going to treat us as small. We're powerful, they're going to treat us as weak. And we're not the poorest country in the world, even if we're not the richest, so we shouldn't be dismissed. China, in the same way, and it goes even to the Justin Lim story that you're telling, right, joins the WTO, gets involved in global trade, feels that it's trying, the slogan was, peaceful rise. Let the global institutions be more or less what they are, broadly capitalist system with the World Bank and the IMF and all of that. We will rise together with the others within that system. Now, why does that slogan begin to feel obsolete? Because there's a ceiling beyond which China is not allowed to rise. Does it get to have heads of the World Bank or the IMF? No, second-tier European powers do, because that's the tradition among the Western elite in running that club. So there should always be something for France and something for Britain and something, right? Not China. China isn't introduced into the core power circle of this. And that's a key reason why you get the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, why you get a set of Chinese institutions to be alternatives to the Western institutions. Now back to Taiwan, right? If we continue on the path of having separate institutions and having a path for China that is not well integrated with the West, we increase the chance of China invading Taiwan, right? So we are partly responsible, right? Not because we would make that horrible, immoral, and bad decision, but because we made a variety of other decisions. Short-term decisions in the business world, and with regard to our global institutions, we did not look to find a way to fully incorporate China in a position of leadership, so it said we're big enough and strong enough that together with some other countries, with Brazil, with India, with Russia, we can build an alternative global order. I don't think that was China's first choice. I think that was China's response to the West saying, we don't want you. And that was a terrible mistake, and it may yet cost us war.
Wow. Okay. Now, that was amazing. Thank you, Dr. Calhoun. That was an incredible statement, an incredible sort of linking together of the things we want to say. I want to jump in a little bit on this. So what I want to ask of Diane and Tarun is I want to jump in on this particular topic and close this out. And then Diane and Tarun, and I'm going to end with you, Tarun, but I would love for you to tackle the question that Mac is asking about what would somebody who wants to work in China do? Like, what should we be thinking about in terms of, if I could just, I'm paraphrasing your question, but, you know, somebody who's graduating from Thunderbird and wants to hold true to their own values and values that we grow up and care about, but then wants to go have a career like you've had, Diane, or Tarun, what you're thinking about in terms of the future. Is that okay with you guys if I jump in on this particular topic and then you guys handle the student topic? Is that okay? And Diane, you can bring in any other topic you want. It's okay. You're a panel expert. But I just want to come back, and Craig said a couple of things that I've alluded to, but I think it's really important. You know, and I just know it personally from some of the people I know in the Chinese government. It is offensive that the #2 economy in the world is at the kids' table of the G20. And so we have to take some responsibility for not having invited China to the table and really kind of thinking, well, we're going to still treat you as kids, and you know, we'll see if we'll let you in the door at some point. And so I just think we're not beyond culpability in this dynamic, and we just need to think about, you know, personally, I really enjoyed in the 1990s the era of engagement. You know, in 1994, we said, all right, we're really going down this engagement road because if we want to help China get into the WTO, we need certain things to happen to make that happen by 2001. And it felt like a very rich engagement period. Now, again, we didn't see Xi Jinping coming, and there's stuff to be reckoned with here. I'm not an apologist for Xi Jinping, and indeed it was heartbreaking to me watching what was happening. But it's really important that the 2 largest economies in the world are engaged and working constructively. And on this issue, I think it's really important to ask the question, what would it take for us to not have a war? My personal view is, barring some unforeseen declaration of independence, which I don't think is going to happen, there will not, in the short term, be a war. Why? Because of the question that Charles asked. I think he left. But here again, we can talk about Motorola, but let's talk about the company that I know the best. Apple is the most profitable company in the world because of China. Apple and Tesla are married to China. We had the number for the White House when we were dealing with the Trump administration. Because, here's my favorite statistic, Apple controls 30% of the smartphone market share in the world. Anybody want to guess what percentage of profits it takes? My students, you can't say. Anybody? 70, 80, 92. Why do they take 92? It's not because the products are so much better. It's because of the ways in which they operate the manufacturing supply chain in China. The fact that Foxconn built a factory in Chennai means nothing. Nothing. Because Apple is married to China. And if there was a war and Apple and Tesla and Walmart, the single largest exporter from China to the United States, if those 3 were kicked out of China, the U.S. economy through the capital markets would plummet. Everybody's 401ks would be hit. And so there's just, you know, we have to get back to sort of logical thinking here. Like, this ain't happening. And the only way to go through this is collective engagement. And here again, we can talk about China stealing intellectual property, but we were given it. Like, we were given it because we needed China because it was the source of our profitability. Okay, a couple of other quick comments. We have an advisor to the president of Indonesia. Hold on one second.
At the moment when you're mentioning about Apple and Microsoft, like right now both CEOs are in Indonesia. And CEOs just recently, the CEO of Microsoft just recently announced that he's going to be investing around $17 billion for the AI and chips development in the country. And also some other companies of the US companies also coming. What I think is that looking at the China and US relationship, USA is so busy at looking at on the side of like how China is doing the strategy, the future plans and everything, and they forget to look at how China acquired the market significantly. Like, they're not busy looking at the USA from security, whatever it is, a point of view, but they're busy doing building relationship, strengthening relationship with other countries, especially in the Southeast Asia, and that's how they acquire and capture the big market size, and they're doing really well. So I think just a recommendation on how USA also, instead of like being sheriff and policy to the world, also looking at building relationship beyond Russia and China and, you know, acquire the same market size. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your comments. Okay, I want to come to Diane and Tarun. Diane, over to you. And you know, you can talk about anything you want because this is you're the expert here on the panel. But I would love it if we could move over to Mac's question and start to wind things down. And by the way, for those who still have their hands up, we all invite everybody to continue this conversation up at the Thunderbird Pub, which is an institution at Thunderbird. So, but Diane, over to you.
Well, as you know, I prefer to share my experiences through my personal experience. So I was having lunch with a Chinese woman who was raised in Xinjiang province and who then worked her little butt off, as they do, to get herself into Jiao Tong University in Shanghai. So that would be the top 5 universities in China, which is, you know, comparable in difficulty, probably even harder to get into given the number of applicants. And then she went to Stanford to get an MBA. And now she runs a U.S. company in China that is from South Carolina, a privately owned company. So we're talking about someone who has seen a lot, who's experienced a lot, who runs a business, who is cross-border every single day. And we were having a discussion a few years back, this is several years ago now, but about leadership in China and the decisions that were being made. And Xi Jinping, of course, keeps coming up. And her answer to me was very simple. She said, Diane, don't you think we Chinese know when we have a bad leader? Don't you think we know when we don't like our government? And right now, this is the government we have, and this is the government we'll work with. And when that time comes, that's our decision. It's not anyone else's decision. So I think we forget when we focus on the big man. And in fact, the US tendency is in every country we don't particularly agree with, we pick out their leader and as the symbol of everything about that country. And we should be careful because in China, at least, well, it is true that Xi Jinping has been able to consolidate his position. He's not alone. He has advisors and he has his even international advisors. He has investors that all impact what his decision-making should be. And he's the voice of the country. So I think my friend hit it on the nail that we don't understand why the Chinese people don't like their government. They actually are apolitical about their government as long as it's achieving what they agree on. And my last comment points to that is the Chinese people honestly believe to the depths of their soul that economic development, all boats rise with the tide. They believe that this is the way to common prosperity. So someone very early in our 2 hours ago may have been asking the question, what is China about? This concept of common prosperity, which some people could say, oh, that's Marxist. Well, it's also in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament that we're all going to share the benefits of the economic prosperity that's around us. And they do believe this, and the Chinese government expresses it. The ambassador Xie Feng was just speaking at Harvard, I think last week. If you go to that speech, it captures everything that the Chinese government point of view. And sometimes we take those points of view and say, oh no, that's just a power play or words, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is the Chinese people do believe that too. Because these are part of their cultural experience of 5,000 years. Governments rise, governments fall, but as long as the economics are there, stability and harmonious society, it plays a part. And so getting to the topic of Taiwan, we also forget that the Taiwanese people, the Chinese mainland and the people on the island are related to each other. And I got a phone call from my husband's cousins, and they're coming, bringing their grandchildren for 3 weeks in July. This cross-border relationships, they're continuing. So if you leave it to the people, I just don't think there's going to be the need to have war in this situation. But I'd like to also comment to the young man, You don't give up your values to go anywhere in the world. There's absolutely no, you can give up your values in downtown Chicago if you engage in some corruption. That's giving up your values, right? I assume. So why would coming to China you have to give up your values? That is when you are most a great representative of the United States, by sticking to what you want to do and how you want to present yourself on behalf of your country. And that's how many of us see ourselves. So the way we treat our staff, the way that our factories are built, the way that we fulfill our contracts, that is all part of that value statement that we represent. So I've never, ever felt in 40 years of living in China that I've ever given up my values on anything. So that's how I'd finish that off, Doug.
Oh my God, Diane, thank you. That was so beautifully said. Tarun, you have to go after that beautiful statement, but I have faith in you. You're going to be amazing.
She set the bar too high. But getting back to it, one thing I think I really want to talk about here is allies. And if you look at the U.S. allies, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea in that region, that very important region, it's been very interesting over the past 5 years especially, because India has now not only become a regional player, and I'm not saying this because I'm from India, but I've seen it happen when I was there. I was there when COVID broke out. They became a global player. And it's very important about how this Indo-Pacific relations are growing up, because if you look at the Quad relationship that came out with Australia being a very key player, but we see this quadrilateral relationship not only ensuring intelligence, but also knowledge capital, human capital, and just advancement overall. I think there's some kind of tension that's been going on, within the Chinese leadership, because if you look at the Philippines recently, they didn't participate in the military exercise with the U.S. and Japan, but they said that they didn't want to. But if you look at it, some opinions that have been going on around Manila is that the Philippines are, they want to stay bilateral. They want to stay with China. They want to stay with the U.S. because China is the largest trading partner for them. They have a lot of investment and revenue. But if you look at U.S. investors going into China, it's gone down by more than 1/3% according to the Wall Street Journal from 2022 to 2023. So that opens the doors for a lot of things. But if you look at what the allies are saying, again, it goes back to the point of what Diane was saying, what Dr. Callahan was saying, and what Professor Guthrie says a lot of times. It's the hottest moment right now in the past 30 or 40 years. Is it the Cold War? We don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like that. And I think it's going to come down to three things. One, if you open up the small opportunities back again, and that goes back to my point of the Fulbright program. When we do small things like that, that reinstates some type of confidence. It reinstates more cultural exchange, which is more than important now, given this whole technological factor era. And the second point goes to free trade, and also the fairness in our trade. How fair are we playing? Because if I say fair trade in my country, it's different from what you guys think it is and what China thinks or what Philippines thinks. So do we have a common ground for that, or are we just going to leave it up for the World Trade Organization to define what free trade is? And number three, these wars that are going on right now, we've underestimated the power of Russia because they've heavily used, certain drones coming in from Iran. And, if we see, where Iran is getting all that money or, all these relations, it goes back, you keep digging the roots, it keeps on going back to that. But it's not about pointing fingers anymore. It's about, going to the table. It's about, not hosting more conferences, but it's really about getting a solution done and hopefully investing more in young students. I'm not saying invest in me, but, a lot of my, my colleagues here at Thunderbird, we have a lot of passionate people, and that's where I see the future. In my classmates, led by professors like Professor Guthrie and Dr. Callahan, and professionals like Diane as well.
Oh my goodness. So we are at our time, and I'm going to turn it over to Kristen in a second, and I'm hoping we can continue this conversation upstairs. But I just want to say, I have been a member of academic institutions for long periods in my life, even when I was a graduate student, and then first went to work with Craig Calhoun at NYU. I've never been so proud as to be a part of an institution, as to be a part of this moment in this conversation. This is such an important conversation, and as you can tell, all of us care passionately about it, but so do you. And us coming to the dialogue and having wonderful partners like Global Ties Arizona to just foster these kinds of discussions and these kind of conversations, I'm just I'm just in awe. The final thing I'll say to you, Mac, is take advantage of the people around you, right? You have so many people, whether they're peers or professors or business people that you meet, like Diane. Learn as much as you can, but as Diane said, stay true to your values, right? Nothing can shake those values if you have them, and you just stay true to them. And there's going to be plenty of opportunity to advance and learn from the people around you who have had experiences and network your butt off. And I mean that in the best way, because we are here to share ideas and to share experiences and to help the next generation of people go out and change the world. And that's what we want to do, is we want to change the world for the better. So over to you, Kristen. Thank you for having us.
Well, I'm standing between everyone and the reception that we have upstairs at the Thunderbird Pub, but I do just want to thank Dr. Doug Guthrie for facilitating a phenomenal conversation this afternoon. I'd like to ask everyone to please give him a round of applause. I also want to thank our esteemed panelists for being here this afternoon to contribute your expertise and your experience to the conversation. Diane Long, Dr. Craig Calhoun, and Tarun Masapeda. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for contributing to this dialogue today. I think this was an enormous success for a first-time change-up of how we run this event, and this is absolutely what Global Ties Arizona does. And if you found this dialogue intriguing, engaging, I want to encourage you to get involved with us. Today we had a free event for us to be able to put on these types of events free to the community and engage more of our community members in these conversations. We ask that you consider making a contribution to Global Ties Arizona to support us and giving us the opportunity to continue to offer these types of forums to our community. So that said, we're going to head up to the pub on the 5th floor. When you get there, if you do have, just check in at the registration table. If you do have a name tag that has an R on it, please pick up your drink ticket on the way in. If you don't, check in with the registration table on your way in. Again, we really, really appreciate you being here, being a part of the conversation. And also, thank you so much to the board members of Global Ties that are here, our chairman, Barry Wong, as well as the Global Ties Arizona staff and volunteers that helped to make this day possible. Thank you, everyone. See you upstairs. Thank you, Diane.